Every week, some new occurrence of people in countries all around the world expressing their dissatisfaction with the state of things. We just saw it, of course, in the United Kingdom just this week with the British experiencing the worst defeat since Lexington and Concord. If I was pressed to give just a one-word explanation to someone who didn't understand what is happening, not just in the United States, but everywhere, I would say immigration. I think that this issue, immigration and the border, more than any other single issue, encapsulates the issues feeding the angst that human beings are experiencing. Economic anxiety, questions about their security, questions about the changes in their culture, questions about the very rule of law itself. It all comes down to who are we? Can we be anything that anyone says we are? Does anything matter? These are some of the deepest questions, I think, that the people of a nation must grapple with. Before we get going, if I may, just read a quote that I had occurrence to stumble upon recently that I think resonates with that fundamental question. All this even is not the full extent of the evil. By such examples, by instances of the perpetrators of such acts going unpunished, the lawless in spirit are encouraged to become lawless in practice. And having been used to no restraint but dread of punishment, they thus become absolutely unrestrained. Having ever regarded government as their deadliest bane, they make a jubilee of the suspension of its operations and pray for nothing so much as its total annihilation. While, on the other hand, good men who love tranquility, who desire to abide by the laws and enjoy their benefits, who would gladly spill their blood in the defense of their country, seeing their property destroyed, their families insulted, and their lives in danger, their persons injured, and seeing nothing in prospect that forebodes a change for the better, become tired of and disgusted with a government that offers them no protection, and are not much averse to a change in which they imagine they have nothing to lose. Thus, then, by the operation of this mobocratic spirit, which all must admit is now abroad in the land, the strongest bulwark of any government, and particularly of those constituted like ours, may effectually be broken down and destroyed. I mean the attachment of the people. Abraham Lincoln in 1838. With that, let me introduce our panelists today, starting with Mark Krikorian, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. I'm sure you all are familiar with his extensive work and leadership in the movement going all the way back to at least 1995, and likely before. Mark is the author of several books, and you can find him on X at Mark S. Krikorian. Mark was once described by Commentary magazine as the leading theorist of immigration restriction in America. I'm glad you're here, Mark. Sitting next to him is Theo Wold. Theo is the director of the Administrative State Project at the Claremont Institute. He is recently the former Solicitor General of Idaho. He was an acting assistant attorney general in the DOJ and a deputy assistant to the president for policy in the White House under President Trump. And before that, he was also deputy chief counsel to U.S. Senator Mike Lee at the Judiciary Committee. You can see Theo's work at Real Theo Wold. Next to him is my colleague at the Heritage Foundation, our visiting fellow, Mr. Tom Homan. Tom is the former acting director of ICE. He has worked on border security issues, including as a Border Patrol agent, going all the way back to 1984, which is the year that I was born. I found this quote about Mr. Homan in the pages of the Washington Post, where they said, "Thomas Homan deports people, and he's really good at it." And then we will wrap with our opening comments with Mr. Kevin Lin, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Sound Public Policy. He's also the founder of U.S. Tech Workers, and spent 10 years as a U.S. Army officer serving our nation. You can find Mr. Lin's work at Then Comes Kevin. With that, Mr. Lin.
Thank you for making me sound very old, Aaron. 1984, I was in graduate school. My gosh, I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. From the Rio Grande to the Mediterranean, from the English Channel to the River Jordan, from Poland to South Africa, the existential threat to national sovereignty is the same: asylum. Not abuse of asylum, but asylum policy itself. In a 2019 statement on the border emergency, President Trump said, "A nation without borders is not a nation at all." And what asylum does is not lead to open borders. This, I think, is a mistake in our terminology. There's still somebody at the border. What it does is it takes away the ability of democratic governments to control who enters and lives in their own countries. Since the end of the Cold War, the forces opposed to the very idea of the nation have made increasing use of the post-World War II asylum regime to subvert the ability of self-governing peoples to control who enters and remains in their own countries. The current system, usually referred to just as refugee system, but in our law and US law, there's a difference between refugees and asylum, was established in 1951 with the Convention relating to the status of refugees. Only applied to people in Europe, and it only applied to people who had been displaced before the convention was ratified or signed. In other words, people displaced by World War II and the Red Army subjugation of Eastern Europe. That framework was then universalized in 1967 in what is called the Protocol relating to the status of refugees, which was exactly the same. It just applied everywhere in the world and applied prospectively in the future. And there are two aspects to this, one of which is not problematic, the other is, I think, the fundamental existential threat to national sovereignty. The first one is refugee resettlement. This is a sovereign act where a person who is in a camp or something overseas is brought into a country of resettlement. It could be a good idea, bad idea, it could be done well, it could be done poorly, but it is a sovereign act of the nation involved. The other part, and this is the problematic part, is asylum. Asylum is for an alien who is already in the country, usually illegally, and then seeks refugee status as a way of avoiding deportation. It represents a surrender of sovereignty, a pledge to permit foreigners to decide who's going to live in your country, rather than the citizens of that country. It reframes immigration as a right rather than a privilege, a claim that an illegal immigrant can make against a country, regardless of what the laws of that country set as far as levels and characteristics of immigration. Essentially, it makes border control contingent on international treaties. Now, the framers of the original version, the 1951 convention, understood this potential threat to sovereignty, and so they included various provisos and caveats, the most important one of which is that illegal immigrants must be considered for asylum, but only if they come directly from the country where they were being persecuted. The thing is that during the first 4 decades of this asylum regime, the surrender of sovereignty that asylum represents wasn't really much of an issue. Because the United States did not sign on to the original convention because the Truman administration rightly considered the threat to national sovereignty. But in 1967, we did sign on to the universalizing version of it, the protocol, because what harm could it do? And the reason it wasn't a problem is because asylum essentially was reserved for a handful of Russian ballerinas. It was a tiny phenomenon, and so the surrender of national sovereignty that asylum represents was not all that consequential or salient. But four things have happened in the intervening last 30 years that fundamentally changed that. One is the Cold War is ending. One of the reasons the nations of the free nations of the world were able to talk about asylum as a right is that almost nobody could get out of the Soviet Empire. And so it was almost a kind of virtue signaling that we weren't called on, we weren't challenged on what asylum could represent, because the handful of people got out were easily accommodated. That's gone. There is no Cold War, obviously. It was 30 years ago, even though many people still think it's going on, it isn't. The second change is huge growth in global population, especially in the kind of developing countries where poverty and disorder and misrule create powerful incentives to leave. The third change is the huge drop in the cost of transportation and communications. Everybody knows this is true, but I looked up a couple of numbers just to kind of give that some shape. In 1950, around the time they were putting together the Refugee Convention, a 3-minute phone call from Boston to London in current dollars cost $50 a minute. Now it's free. Everybody has mobile phones. Anybody who's watched the Fox News video from the border, you see all of the people coming across have mobile phones. Communication is now essentially free. Transportation, likewise, dramatically less expensive than it was. When I was a kid, we had put on our Sunday best to go on a plane because it was a big deal before Eric was born. But the fact is now it's like a Greyhound bus. It's dramatically cheaper, so people can get here. But even all of that isn't enough. Yes, the Cold War is over. Yes, population growth is dramatic in the third world. It's cheaper to get here and to collect information. But the fourth change is key, and that is that the elites of modern countries have lost the cultural self-confidence necessary to actually defend their countries. John Lennon's song, Imagine, is the shahada of global progressivism. And its line, imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, is precisely what most of our leadership class now imagines. These changed conditions, these four changes over the past 30 years have turned asylum seeking into the main vehicle of mass illegal immigration. We've all seen this. I won't go into too much detail about what we've seen, but the 2015-2016 migration crisis in Europe was driven by asylum, ostensibly. In fact, Angela Merkel said something which I think really highlights the problem here. At the time, she was asked, well, how many refugees can Germany take? Apparently, even reporters were kind of aghast at what was happening. And she said this, quote, I assume this is a translation, "The basic right to asylum for politically persecuted persons has no upper limit. This also applies to refugees who come to us from the hell of a civil war." This is the logical endpoint of the 1951 refugee and asylum regime. And that what happened in Europe pales beside what we're seeing at our own southern border. This administration, ostensibly because people are seeking protection, has taken into custody and then let go more than 3.5 million illegal border crossers, on top of all kinds of other ways that illegal immigrants get into the country. And it's not just here, you're seeing it now in the Mediterranean. You saw a few years ago, Belarus tried to weaponize asylum policy against the EU by inviting Middle Eastern illegal immigrants in and then busing them to the Polish border, the point being to punish Europe, because once they're in Europe, they can't, it's the leadership classes of those countries simply do not have the will or even the inclination to remove those people. So there's been some responses to try to keep the asylum system in place, to preserve it, but to rein in the abuses of it. Remain in Mexico was a policy that the Trump administration adopted, formerly called the Migrant Protection Protocols, where illegal immigrant border jumpers were still allowed to apply for asylum in the United States, but had to wait in Mexico for their hearings. And it was very effective, but a half measure, because it kept in place the magnet of applying for asylum. Various countries, Israel, Britain, and Denmark, tried to deal with the asylum threat by forming an agreement with Rwanda to deport rejected asylum seekers to Rwanda if they couldn't be deported to their own countries. Israel did it for a few years until their Supreme Court decided it was unreasonable and just canceled it. Denmark, for some reason, shelved it, never really launched it, and Britain now with the new Labour government has canceled their, the agreement with Rwanda. Italy has tried something similar. I call it Remain in Albania, where illegal immigrants coming to Italy are sent to Albania for processing, but they still are permitted to apply for asylum in the EU, and so the magnet is still there. The problem is that these are all second best solutions. They're not solutions. They're attempts at dealing with asylum and the problems it creates by trying to deal with the margins. The fact is that any administrative measures like this can always be undone by subsequent administrations. And the pull of asylum, the potential of it is still there. And asylum, even asylum law, even its abuse is limited, that pull still remains. The big reason being that one of the grounds for getting asylum is being persecuted based on membership in a particular social group, which means whatever a judge and an activist want it to mean. And so however effective the guardrails are around it, that particular weakness remains. And so fixing this problem of asylum must start by withdrawing from the Refugee Convention and the Protocol, and withdrawing from the Convention Against Torture, and withdrawing from the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights. All of those create rights for infiltrators, illegal immigrants, coming into developed countries. And specifically in the case of Europe, European countries are not going to be able to regain control of their borders until they withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, which is something Nigel Farage and his Reform Party, one of the issues they were campaigning on. And the immigration right that all these agreements create is specifically a requirement of what's in French is called non-refoulement. Non-refoulement, it would be in English, but that's not a word in English, so we use, in other words, not to send people back to where they're being persecuted. The problem is not that we should be sending people back to where they're being killed or persecuted. The imperative of this really etched itself in our leadership class after World War II, when we sent back Soviet POWs that we had liberated back to Stalin, and they were all killed. So the idea of non-refoulement is still valid. The problem is it needs to be up to national governments to decide who they will and will not send back. Broad national agreements trying to limit the sovereignty of developed countries are even worse than some of the other broad international agreements. And the thing that comes to mind to me is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Those of you who studied diplomatic history will know, and it's still in effect. The Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1920s banned war. War is illegal, just in case anybody was in doubt about that. One of the skeptics in the Senate, when it was up for ratification, referred to it as an international kiss. But he said, if we are going to throw a kiss, let us understand that it does not carry with it any obligation of matrimony. The problem is that the international kiss, represented by the Refugee Convention, the Torture Convention, the Covenant on Civil and Human Rights, does create obligations, and those obligations are weaponized by anti-sovereignty elements within our own countries to prevent self-governing peoples from governing themselves. And so what we need to do in subsequent to withdrawing from these conventions is, by legislation, to prohibit by law any asylum claim from an illegal immigrant. There is no way to get around this. As a movie from the 1980s said, the only way to win is not to play the game. The one twist or issue that we're going to have to consider is there are still going to be some people who manage to illegally immigrate whom either we don't want to send back or whom we can't send back because their country won't cooperate. And in order to deal with that, something like the British and Israeli Rwanda agreement is going to be necessary. I call it Remain in Mongolia, so that no one who crosses the border illegally is even permitted to submit an asylum claim. There is no claim of protection that we even entertain, but we will fly into Mongolia or Bolivia or whatever country we have an agreement with, and it's going to require us to pay large bribes and buy their mistresses apartments and all of that, but whatever it takes, it can be done. And the British Foreign Office did extensive research into in what countries could be persuaded to do this. And they came up with a useful list. I don't think Mongolia was on it, but Botswana was on it, Armenia was on it. There's all kinds of countries that will be willing to take our money in order to host a small number of illegal immigrants. And the point, of course, is the numbers won't be large, because if sneaking across the American border simply lands you in Ulaanbaatar, which I hear it's nice this time of year, but nonetheless, that's not what you're looking for. And the incentive is going to disappear, and the number of people that Mongolia or wherever would have to accommodate on our behalf isn't going to be that large. So my basic takeaway here is that asylum is not something we can tweak around the edges and try to limit abuses and make it better. Those are all things that, if in the short term we have to do, I'm all for. But ultimately, asylum must not be available to illegal immigrants, period. Otherwise, there is no ability for countries attracting immigration to actually succeed in controlling the borders.
You are living in an experiment. In March of this year, the foreign-born or immigrant population in the United States, both legal and illegal, hit record highs. 51.6 million people in the United States are foreign-born. That is more than 15% of the population of this country, higher than at any time in our nation's history. Many consider these immigrants to be nothing more than workers, but more than half of the immigrants who have arrived since 2022 are not employed. And of the approximately 2.5 million recent arrivals who are not employed, only about 8% say they are actively looking for work. Immigrants now make up over a fifth of the residents in California, New Jersey, and New York, and Texas, and Florida, our most populous states. But less populous states are also seeing unprecedented immigration growth. The immigrant population is growing by 40% in Delaware, North and South Dakota, and West Virginia. An experiment is a test to discover if something works. The numbers I've just described are a national experiment. And the American people, they're the guinea pigs. We know this is an experiment, a test for which we don't know the outcome, because this level of immigration is new and different in at least three fundamental ways. First, the scale. The amount of immigration we are experiencing is unlike anything our country has experienced before. The United States is now home to more international migrants than any other country in the world, and more than the next 4 countries on the list combined. And in fact, no country in modern or ancient history has experienced numbers like these. Second, the speed. 9 million aliens entered the country in all of the 1990s. Now, 10 million have entered during just the first 3 years of the Biden administration, with 58% of that increase coming from illegal immigration. This growth is far greater than even our government predictions would expect. The federal census data from 2020 predicted that the foreign-born population of the United States would not hit 15% until 2034. Yet it is 2024, and we have already surpassed that prediction. Third, this wave of immigration is unprecedented in its diversity. Previous waves of immigration tended to come from particular parts of the world that made absorption and assimilation easier. But now immigrants come from every corner of the globe, speak every language and dialect, worship every kind of God, and reflect every culture that exists on the planet. And all of this matters because immigration can only be sustained when it is assimilated. This is not a new idea. Our founders discussed and agreed unanimously, nearly unanimously, on this point. As Jefferson put it, immigrants, quote, should distribute themselves sparsely among the native population for quicker amalgamation. So consider the practical the practical implications of immigration of this size. Immigrants are more likely to be low-skilled compared to native-born Americans. According to one study, nearly a third of adult immigrants to the United States lack even a high school education. And about half of the immigrants to the United States have limited, if any, English proficiency. So imagine a newly arrived immigrant to this country who is low-skilled, has fewer than 12 years of education, speaks little, if any, English, and generally knows nothing about American culture, government, our Constitution, or even their own individual legal rights. Of course, that person can succeed here. And there are inspiring stories of those who have. But that person cannot succeed without a lot of help. Education, language remediation, instruction about citizenship and our history, a supportive and high-trust community that is capable of conveying and reinforcing this information, plus job training, public assistance, housing assistance, healthcare assistance, and the list goes on. Now multiply that one person by tens of millions. We do not have a system for providing the help that millions of immigrants need to succeed in this country. And of course, a government that is confused about basic biology and incapable of fulfilling basic functions like holding free and fair elections is not equipped to assimilate tens of millions of foreign nationals. Now, this is different than previous generations. We're told that immigration is a part of America's heritage, so we have to accept it. But during the height of the progressive era in the United States, American businesses who imported immigrant labor also voluntarily promoted Americanization. Henry Ford, for example, compelled his immigrant employees to attend 8-month-long English language courses and other Americanization activities, believing that it was his responsibility to teach them, and this is a quote from Mr. Ford, American ways, the English language, and the right way to live. This was not unique among American corporations, and it spread to many now well-known nonprofits. Eventually, 30 states enacted legislative Americanization programs. I don't have to tell you that there are no widespread corporate Americanization efforts trying to assimilate immigrants to this country today. In fact, in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Americanization efforts are actively discouraged. So today, our country is experimenting with the massive importation of immigrants to this country, a majority of them illegal. It is an experiment because it has never been done before, and no one can assure you that it can work or that it will work. So who's running this experiment, and why? There are two main groups. First, the elites in this country. Upper class, ruling elites are the ones in the position to decide whether our border is open or closed, and to what degree. And elites benefit from open borders, so that is what they choose. Elites can afford home help and other services, and those things are cheaper if there is a plentiful labor class of low-skilled workers. And that's because low-skilled immigrant workers compete primarily with low-income native-born workers, who then suffer disproportionately from the effects of mass immigration. Low-income native-born workers suffer almost a 1% drop in income for every 1% increase in the immigrant composition of their industry. And although mass immigration has a cascading negative effect throughout the economy, the elite are largely blind to those effects. Unsurprisingly, housing, more than 51 million immigrants, causes pressures on the domestic housing supply. Home prices in this country have skyrocketed, making homes now unaffordable in 80% of the United States. And in more than half of the United States, home prices are accelerating faster than wages. Immigrants are straining healthcare availability throughout the country. Just one, safety net hospital in the city of Denver treated 20,000 illegal immigrants in 2023 alone, accounting for $15 million of uncompensated free healthcare. And immigrants are also straining public schools. Again, in the city of Denver, their public schools in a typical year enroll around 250 illegal immigrant children. They've averaged 500 illegal immigrant children per week this year. An enormous unplanned for cost caused by this surge has required emergency appropriations, paying for everything from remedial English language education and then sourcing healthcare, food, and other services for illegal immigrant minors. Immigration also stresses state and federal penal systems. According to the Department of Justice, 1 in 5 federal prisoners is now an alien. And although many of them are in prison because they committed immigration offenses, many more are incarcerated for other reasons. 46% of these aliens have committed drug trafficking or other drug-related offenses, and another 25% have committed a variety of other violent criminal offenses, like rape. I don't need to remind anyone here of the ever-increasing number of cases of young American women who have been raped and murdered by illegal aliens in this country. Every crime committed by someone present illegally is a preventable crime. Illegal aliens impose enormous social welfare costs on the country, receiving between 84 and 94 billion more in government benefits and services than they pay in taxes. All of these things disadvantage low and middle income Americans disproportionately. And to add insult to injury, our current DEI regime ensures that a leg up will be given to foreign-born candidates when they come into direct competition with native-born Americans, and most especially, though not exclusively, native-born whites. Elites, however, can weather these consequences by buying their way into private health care, private schools, and gated neighborhoods. So for elites, open borders are all upside, and that's part of why we have them. The other group behind our mass immigration crisis are multiculturalists, who supply the ideological underpinnings of open borders. Multiculturalism gained ascendancy in the 1990s and has only strengthened its grip since then. Multiculturalism at root is an anti-Western ideology. It holds that America is composed of many distinct cultures, that the dominant Protestant Anglo culture of the founding has systematically subjugated these cultures, and that these cultures must be liberated. Why? Because America shouldn't have a single culture. Disunion is the express goal. Multiculturalism has completely pervaded our educational system for decades and is adopted at the highest level of the Democrat Party and the US administrative state, and it is even unthinkingly espoused by some Republicans. The result is that the United States is unique among all the nations of the world in that we encourage immigrants to hold on to their language, their culture, and their birth country identity. And ever greater numbers of immigrants only make this phenomenon easier. With greater numbers, it is easier to replicate one's home country on American soil, and so to avoid assimilation altogether. US immigrants' countries of origins want this effect and deliberately cultivate it. Wealthy nations can advocate their strategic foreign policy interests through their wealth, their power, and their influence. But poor countries do it by exporting people. The net effect of elite policy preferences combined with the pathology of multiculturalism is that we are seeing nothing short of the colonization of America. If you doubt this, look no further than Representative Ilhan Omar's now famous rally in Minnesota just last month. She spoke Somali to a crowd almost exclusively of Somali immigrants. And when the Prime Minister of Somalia took the podium in support of Representative Omar, he said her, quote, interests aren't those of Minnesota or even the American people, but those of Somalia. So how will a future Trump administration decolonize America? Well, let me be honest. I'll be light on specifics here, and that's intentional. This is time for discretion. We've seen too many of our policy ideas announced in advance, only to be reverse engineered by blue state attorneys general and leftist interest groups into successful legal challenges. But in my mind, there are two basic things to be done. If you encounter the federal government directly and you are present here illegally, you will be sent home. Period. No gotaways, not at the border, but also not in the interior of the country. No orders of removal will not be executed. Now, many will say that we should prioritize only the removal of criminal aliens. Violent criminal aliens at that. Those who have raped or murdered or assaulted American citizens. Let me be clear on this. Such a policy essentially endorses indefinite lawlessness at our borders and makes explicit that anyone and everyone can come to the United States and remain in perpetuity until they harm one of you. No, removal is not reserved for violent criminals. It is the consequence of having immigrated into our country illegally. Second, we need to start making it a little less good for those present in the country illegally by making things a little more fair for native-born Americans. Right now, illegal immigrants in many American cities are receiving 2 years of free housing, free health care, food assistance, and other benefits, including benefits that have never been extended to native-born Americans, including American citizens who have fought and bled for this nation in foreign conflicts. And illegal aliens are also competing with Americans in so many other aspects of life: banking, healthcare, housing. In all of these areas, every effort must be made to serve those who are lawfully present first, in fairness. To give you an example of what I mean, in July 2023, Florida required emergency rooms to ask patients their immigration status. And in the year that followed, Florida has experienced a 54% reduction in spending on emergency care through its federally mandated Medicaid program for illegal aliens. In the words of one pro-immigration activist, Florida has now experienced, quote, an exodus of migrants. In many instances, however, it is proving to be too little, too late. I know what too late looks like. That's why I'm willing to say these hard truths. I grew up in a small-scale experiment of the kind now being attempted at the national level. Stockton, California, the city of my birth, was the first city in the United States in which more than 50% of the city's residents were minorities. A number, obviously, that included native-born blacks and Hispanics, who were already disproportionately facing economic hardship, but who are now faced with an enormous influx of low-skilled, foreign-born immigrants. There are those who will say that it is just coincidence that today's Stockton is one of the most violent jurisdictions in the history of modern America, with consistently one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country. That it's just coincidence that the city is replete with long-forgotten diseases, like a 55% spike in tuberculosis just this year. That it's just coincidence that despite its high crime rate and persistent joblessness of around 22%, Stockton has some of the most unaffordable housing in America. Stockton is the kind of community where ordinary American citizens, black, white, brown, are alienated from their own country, made to feel unwelcome in their own neighborhoods. And the immigrants who survive a place like Stockton are those who work hard, privilege education, speak English, and love this country. So while I appreciate the knowledge I gained from the multiculturalists about the architecture of Angkor Wat, the food of the Mayas, and the zodiac tradition of Lunar New Year, my classmates and I would have been better served to learn the story of this nation's founding, to have been Americanized. So the Stockton experiment, which has been an unmitigated disaster for the past 60 years, proves why the only solution is to decolonize America. There is simply no sustainable way to absorb the immigration this country has experienced and remain a cohesive nation. But already, I'll wrap up here, the corporate media are suggesting that the very thought, just the thought, of deporting anyone is racist and genocidal. But I've explained the experiment to you, and I think we're far enough along for the facts to give us a good idea of how this is going to come out. Pat Buchanan once asked whether in an age of mass immigration we can truly say we're still one nation and one unified people. It's a question we should still be asking today, because we cannot live solely on the memory of our republic. Mass immigration left unchecked and without consequence will only continue. And it will remain incompatible with America as we once knew it and hoped to know it again. It is profoundly unfair to millions of Americans in this country who have been pushed aside for the arrival of millions of foreign nationals, all in the service of elite policy preferences in the ideology of multiculturalism. It's time not just to end mass immigration, but to reverse it, to rediscover American culture, not to multiculturalize it, to decolonize and then re-Americanize this country.
It's always tough following two intellectual speakers, because that ain't me. So after 3 cups of coffee and a Red Bull, I'm going to go where I go. You know, I took a plane trip last week to go meet with President Trump, and something happened when I was boarding the plane. I was first on the plane, the captain comes out to the galley, says, "Hey, I thought that was you. I appreciate your service to the country. I hope you come back." He goes, "But I got a question for you." He goes, "Why are you always pissed off?" I see on TV you're upset. I see you talk in front of Congress you're upset. I said, "Because I'm pissed off." So I want to talk about the border and why I'm pissed off, and why the border isn't just a crisis of the day. We've had crises on the border before. We had a surge in 14-15. We had thousands coming across back when I was border patrol in the 1980s. But this one is different. This border crisis is the biggest national security vulnerability this country has seen, ever. I've worked for 6 presidents. I say this all the time. I'll keep drilling this down. I've worked for 6 presidents, starting with Ronald Reagan. I became a border patrol. Every president I worked for took steps to secure the border, because they clearly understood you can't have strong national security if you don't have border security. You need to know who's coming in, what's coming in, why it's coming in, where it's coming in. We need to do that. No one did better than President Trump. I'm a Trump guy, not ashamed of it. Trump was unprecedented in his success on the southern border. Illegal immigration was down 83 to 90%. Illegal immigration was at a 45-year low. No one had that kind of success. And he did that by himself, because Congress certainly wasn't helping him. You had the Republicans, never Trumpers, they weren't helping the first 2 years. We had the House, the Senate, and the White House. And he still had unprecedented success because he was an out-of-the-box thinker. He came up with some great executive orders. So every president took steps to secure the border. Even Clinton and Obama took steps to secure the border. But you got to think about the current president. President Joe Biden is the first president in the history of this nation who came into office and unsecured the border on purpose. Signing over 90 executive orders, abolishing everything we created under the Trump administration. I wrote an op-ed 6 months before the election for Fox. I said, if Joe Biden becomes president, we lose the border. And man, did the left come out. Holman, there's Holman again, the fear monger, trying to scare people. Well, I just said, look, if Joe Biden was running on end ICE detention, I'm going to have an amnesty. We're going to fix DACA. We're going to give free health care to illegal aliens. I mean, you all them type of promises to the whole world, they're going to come. It didn't take a border expert to understand that. So he unsecured the border on purpose, which has caused the biggest national security crisis I've ever seen. Now, I've been called all kinds of names. I don't give a shit what people think about me. I never have and never will. Because the way they cancel you, well, let's say bad things about them. They won't want to say anything anymore. They're not going to shut me up. Because if they wore my shoes for 34 years and seen the things I've seen, they'd understand me. They might not agree with me, but they understand me. Actually, when I go give speeches around the country, if protesters don't show up, I'm kind of disappointed. Because if they show up, it means my message is getting out. I'm emotional about this subject because of my experience doing this job. I started in Border Patrol in 1984. I became a special agent for a couple of decades, investigating organizations that smuggle and traffic in women and children, illegal aliens, and drugs and guns. I did it for 20 years. President Trump made me the ICE director under his leadership. Probably the proudest moment in my life because I was the first director of ICE that actually came up to the ranks. The 20,000 men and women that worked for me, I didn't ask them to do anything, I knew myself. The morale at ICE was at an all-time high, not because Tom Holman was a genius, but they had somebody in the front office who did the job, knows how the job is done, knows the difficulties around the job. That's what made one of the things that made President Trump great. He put people in place that knew what they were doing. And again, I'm not a genius, but I did the job for 30 years. I get upset because this administration will call Trump, myself, you guys are white nationalists, you're racist, your policies are inhumane. But let's look at that for a second. Dr. Al Borders did a study, said 31% of women that make that journey through cartels get sexually assaulted. 31% of women admitted it. How many actually got assaulted? Think about that for a moment. 31% admitted sexual assault. So let me ask you a question. When President Trump had illegal immigration down 83%, when 83% less people were coming, how many women were being raped? How many children didn't die crossing the border? How many pounds of fentanyl didn't get into the country to kill Americans? How many known suspected terrorists didn't get in the country because the Border Patrol is 100% on the line, vigilant, doing their job? How many women and children weren't sex trafficked? I don't want to hear this bullshit that the policy is inhumane. President Trump's policy saved lives, thousands of lives. The wall saves lives. The walls work. Every place they built a border barrier, illegal immigration decreased, illegal drug flow decreased. The best thing about the wall is the most vulnerable people, the women and children, can't climb the wall. It means they're going to go to a place where there's not a wall. And what's waiting for them? The men and women wearing green, whose first responsibility is taking care of the humanitarian needs and medical needs. President Trump's policies save lives. Now let's look at Joe Biden's policy, where they said much more humane. Over 2,200 illegal aliens have died across the border since he took the White House. There's a 600% increase in sex trafficking of women and children. At last count, 381 people on terrorist watch lists were arrested trying to cross the border. Almost twice as many on the northern border. 148,000 dead Americans from fentanyl is flowing across the northern border. Cartels are making millions of dollars a year. Joe Biden's policies are killing Americans in record numbers. They're killing illegal aliens in record numbers. His policies aren't humane. That is the truth. Stone cold truth. And what's happening on the border now? They say the border numbers are down. They've come down for several reasons. The first reason is they take thousands of people who enter illegally and decide to bring them to a port of entry on what they call CBP-1 Act, a legal pathway, which isn't legal. I think Mark will agree with me on that, and it's in litigation. But look, they're playing a shell game. They'll take thousands of people who normally enter illegally and bring them to a port of entry, call that legal entry. That way they don't have to come as legal entry. Then they create the CHNV program, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Venezuela. They fly them directly from their countries into our American airports, call that a legal pathway. So yeah, the numbers are down when you play a shell game and move thousands in different programs and call it legal. Now the illegal entries are down, somewhat. And why? Because Mexico stepped up. Why is Mexico all of a sudden stepping up? Because they don't want Trump. Then the gravy train's over. The cartels are playing the game. I look at the daily numbers, they're right around 2,500. Is that a coincidence? That this administration put a target 25? No, the cartels are playing the game too. They want to keep Biden in power. And I guarantee you, day one of his next administration, if he was to win, we're back to business as usual. Because the cartels want to make their billions of dollars. The Mexican government, Mexican law enforcement, Mexican military, many of them want to keep collecting their bribes. Mexico is not our friend when it comes to border security. Mexico wants to fix this problem. Last year, they got $71 billion in remittances from the United States. People who are illegally sending money home. It's against the law in Mexico to traffic in women and children, but they're not enforcing it. It's against the law to transit through Mexico if you're from a foreign nation without a transit visa, but they're allowing it. Don't be fooled what's going on right now. Joe Biden could have fixed this 3.5 years ago. He could have just left everything untouched, just continue the Trump policies. But he purposely abolished all those policies and created the crisis we see today. Why did he wait now to fix it or try to address it? Because of the election. That's the only reason. Meanwhile, thousands of people have died. Thousands. I get pissed off because in my 34 years, I've actually talked to little girls as young as 9 years old that were raped multiple times by the cartel. When you drop to your knees, you look in the eyes of a 9-year-old little girl who had everything innocent and pure stolen from her at the hands of pigs. Her life will never be the same. When you stand in the back of a tractor trailer like I did with 19 illegal aliens at your feet, only a 5-year-old boy, all baked to death because they're trapped in a steel box at 180 degrees. What a horrific death. When you hold dying children, when you hold dead children, which I've done throughout my career, it hardens you. That's why I'm pissed off. Because when President Trump was president, deaths were significantly down. Sex trafficking significantly down. The rape of children and women down. And this administration came in and turned it back on. While we're sitting here today, right now, while you're sitting there listening to me, women are being sexually assaulted by cartels on the Mexican border. It's happening right now. A child will die today on the border. Women and children will be sex trafficked into the United States. They'll get away. They'll be forced into sexual slavery or some sort of forced job or labor. HSI ICE has already found many children working in meatpacking plants as young as 7 years old, cleaning up entrails of animals that were slaughtered that day on the midnight shift. Over 400,000 children have crossed the border under Joe Biden, and they can't find 100,000 of them. Based on my 34 years, I'm telling you right now, many of these children are in forced labor, many of these children are living with predators, many of these children are going to appear in pornographic movies, many of these women are forced into prostitution because the cartels control them. If they don't do what they tell them to do, they'll kill their family back in their homeland. That's what this administration has done. So there's the secret. That's why Tom Homan pissed off. Because we had this locked down. And I tell you what, Washington Post can do all the stories they want me about. Tom Homan's report people is really good at it. They ain't seen shit yet. Wait till 2025. I apologize, Bummer. Probably shouldn't say the S word. My wife tells me to stop saying it. I just, like I said, I don't bring notes. I just go with my heart because of my experience, what I've done, what I've seen. I want to end with this about this border crisis is historic. Millions, never seen before numbers, right? And lately the press has gone, oh, Trump's going to do a historic deportation operation. What a terrible thing to say. What a racist thing to say. No, it's not. On the hands of an historic illegal immigration crisis where millions of people have entered this country illegally or been released into the United States by this administration illegally, here's what you need to know. If you look at the immigration court data, EOIR, over the last decade, nearly 9 out of 10 people who claim asylum at the southern border will never get relief from U.S. courts because they simply don't qualify or they don't show up in court. Asylum is about escaping fear and persecution from your home government because of race, religion, political affiliation, or participation in a specific social group. These people are coming up with a better life. I get that. But it ain't asylum. So 9 out of 10, it's actually, I think, 86.7 last time I looked, but nearly 9 out of 10 will get an order removal. We have to remove them. What's the option? Don't execute the final order from the judge? Because if that's the answer, then what the hell are we doing? Shut down the immigration court. Take the border patrol off the border. If we're not going to enforce the law and have consequences for violating our law, what the hell are we doing? So people say it's ridiculous to have a historic. You've got to have a historic deportation operation. I mean, he was a historical immigration where 9 out of 10 will get an order removal. And I kind of agree with you a little bit. I still think, Tom Homan, we need to prioritize national security threats because we know they're here by the thousands. So we do have to prioritize some people. But I agree with you in one aspect, no one's off the table in the next administration. If you're here illegally, you better be looking over your shoulder. I didn't drive for 120 miles an hour today because I don't want to get ticked. I don't lie on my taxes because I don't want to go to jail. It's not okay to enter this country illegally. It's not okay. When I became the ICE director, the first testimony I did, man, did I take hate for 2 weeks on the left. Tom Homan said during testimony, if you're in the country illegally, you need to be looking over your shoulder. You're damn right. That's the way it's supposed to be. It's not okay to enter this country illegally. It is a crime. If you get deported, come back, it's a felony. It's not okay to enter this country illegally. There's right way and wrong way to be a part of the greatest nation on earth. And what no one's talking about, while they're letting millions of illegal aliens in here, release them illegally, in my opinion, into the United States, there are millions of people standing in line, taking their tests, doing their backgrounds, paying the fees to be part of the greatest nation on earth. I'm not anti-immigrant, never have been. I'm anti-illegal immigration because I understand the whole ugly underbelly of what happens to these people. Illegal immigration is not a victimless crime. I'll leave you with this final thought on the border. I want to foot stop this. This is the biggest national security vulnerability in nation history. Why do I say that? Well, I already say the rest of over 380 people on terrorist watch lists coming across the southern border. We have 2 million known gotaways. 2 million people cross this border. They paid more to get away. You pay the cartels one amount of money to get to the border. Their job's over. Get to the border, turn yourself into a green uniform, job done. But if you want to get away, you got to pay them a hell of a lot more to get you to Chicago or New York and not get arrested by the Border Patrol. Why did 2 million people pay more not to be released in 24 hours, not to get a free airline ticket to the city of their choice, not to get free hotel room, not to get 3 squares a day, not to get work authorization? Why did 2 million people pay more not to have the giveaway program? It doesn't take a genius. They don't want to be vetted. They don't want to be fingerprinted. Border Patrol's arrested people from 181 different countries. Many of these countries sponsor terror. If you don't think a single one, that 2 million, didn't come here to blow something up or harm this country, then you're a moron. Biggest national security vulnerability I've ever seen in my lifetime. I'm telling you right now, I've said it before, something's coming. You don't have 57,000 Chinese military-aged males enter the country without the cooperation of the Chinese government. That just don't happen in China. 32,000 Russians. We have people from Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Uzbekistan. We just stopped 8 from committing a terrorist event. Our intelligence community is not perfect. Thank God they got this one. But God help us of what this administration's caused. So you got my word. Trump comes back in January, I'll be on his heels coming back. And I will run the biggest deportation operation this country's ever seen.
How do you follow up on that? Tom, I think you forgot your notes here. Amazing. 34 years of amazing experience in this field. All right, folks, I am the tail end of this. So if I can impart on you 3 things today, all have considered our time together a success. The first is that illegal immigration good, legal immigration is good, illegal is bad, is a flawed and terrible narrative. Number 2, when it comes to immigration, the numbers matter. Number 3, the harm done to the country by out-of-control employment visa programs and liberal immigration policies is significant, but there are solutions. While the border crisis is certainly a significant aspect of the immigration conversation, and based on what's trending in the news, perhaps the most salient one today, it's not the only immigration issue. I'd argue that the border crisis and immigration are separate issues. Granted, there should be zero tolerance for those that shirk our immigration laws and pass into the country illegally. We should be equally concerned with the numbers of people entering the country each and every year legally. Today, we issue anywhere from between 6 to 8 million non-immigrant visas each year. Before the Biden administration took over and created the fiasco that is our southern border, the largest source of illegal immigration was from those that came here legally on visas and overstayed. Notable centrists like Elon Musk have adopted the notion that illegal immigration is bad and legal is good. They will voice their umbrage at saying that, wow, they're flooding the southern border with people that are going to dilute the vote and favor Democrats in office. While with the same breath, they will say things, and I quote, we want to massively expand legal immigration. Those that are hardworking and won't commit crimes should be welcome to this country, unquote. So in other words, what they're really saying is, please replace us, just do it legally. The United Kingdom and Canada adopted the Elon Musk policies, and they are now paying a hefty price for it. The Tories promised that Brexit would reduce the number of legal immigrants, but instead increased legal pathways that resulted in record-breaking immigration numbers that are far greater today than they were in the past. Prior to 1994, for instance, immigration and emigration to the United Kingdom were roughly balanced. However, last year, roughly 1.2 million people immigrated to the country, and only about 532,000 emigrated. And now 9% of the United Kingdom are foreign-born. In light of this, what did the Tories decide to do? Well, they focused on trying to stop people crossing the channel in boats, and rather than going after legal pathways to immigration. And they were rightly and justifiably thrown out of office last week in the elections. But let's talk about our neighbor to the north. What can we learn there? The record-breaking legal immigration numbers to Canada played a major role in reducing per capita GDP, and much like here, causing a massive housing crisis and also depressing wages. Much of this harm was done by this notion, and we hear it here in the States a lot, staple a green card to a diploma. And it's certainly a policy our Silicon Valley overlords would like to see us adopt. Also, ethnic strife between Sikhs who call themselves Khalistanis and Hindu Indians is a common occurrence now in the streets of Brampton, all thanks to them coming on student visas and then applying for green cards and eventually obtaining Canadian citizenship. As they say, import the third world, get the third world. The cabal running the immigration policy under the Biden administration will happily call your bluff on the notion of illegal bad, illegal good. For instance, in an attempt to bring some order, and Tom talked about this earlier, the Biden administration uses the CBP1 app and they've altered it, or they bastardized it, so that they can admit thousands and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people to the country. I don't know if we call it legally, pseudo-legally, the margarine of legal, but that's what's being done, quote unquote, to say that they're legally admitting people that are technically inadmissible. And once they're admitted, they get paroled into the US, and parole may have been intended for very specific situations, but is now being used to allow those who are inadmissible to temporarily stay in the US until they can find a way to adjust their status, i.e. get a green card. Moreover, if you're an alien who illegally crossed the border into the country, or if you overstayed your visa and you don't want to ever be deported, as Mark talked about earlier, you can always file for asylum and be provided with a work permit. And while you're waiting for your case to be heard before an immigration judge, you get your, which can take about 10 years. This is all legal, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you're a victim of a crime on US soil and you're an immigrant, you may be entitled to a U visa. The U visa was created in 2000 as part of the Victims in Trafficking and Violence Protection Act. Since then, we have seen a rise in aliens staging fake crimes to get the benefit of obtaining the U visa, which provides a pathway to citizenship. Now, there were two recent incidents that involved aliens working at gas stations who paid someone to rob them so they could file a police report saying that they were a victim of a crime. Ironically, things took an unintended turn for the worse when a good guy with a gun in the gun-friendly state of Texas saw the crime being committed and shot the assailant. Yes, it actually happened. This is in Hollywood. So, another form of legal immigration. Let's talk about anchor babies. Many of you are probably aware of the process by which a non-citizen enters the country, has a child here, and that child is a US citizen. They're given a social security number. However, you may not be aware that the largest racket for anchor babies is not illegal aliens who come to the country and have kids. Rather, it's those coming on tourist visas for the express purpose of having a child here so they can obtain an American passport for that child. Miami is a hotbed of this for Russian tourists. Phoenix has a huge Nigerian anchor baby industry, and Los Angeles has a well-trafficked Chinese anchor baby trade. We'll talk more about the H-1B visa later. That was created with the Immigration Reform Act in 1990. But that act, the Immigration Reform Act of 1990, also created the diversity visa. The annual diversity lottery, and it's a lottery, randomly issues 50,000 green cards to anyone from anywhere who submitted an online application. No consideration is given for skills, educational attainment, let alone character. Understand, once submitted, these people are given a pathway to citizenship. Now, since the 1870s, immigration has been used by business interests to beat down wages and keep the wage earning classes off balance. But 120 years later, it's being weaponized now to bring down the salaries of professional white-collar workers. In the 1980s, Eric Bloch, who was the director of the National Science Foundation, foisted on us a report that was neither peer-reviewed nor actually published. And it basically said, roughly 600,000, we're going to have a deficit of 600,000 STEM workers. That's science, technology, engineering, and math. And we need to create a visa employment program that will remedy that. Well, that's how we got the H-1B visa. And this bogus report that it was predicated on was enacted in 1990 by Congress. And I say bogus because in a market-driven economy, labor shortages simply don't exist in the long run. A shortage of workers increases demand in that particular field, and it drives wages up, which attracts more people into the field. And that's exactly what happened in the 1980s and 1990s. Americans learned to code. Not such a good idea anymore. The call to bring in more foreign white-collar workers and STEM workers is an attempt to solve a problem that doesn't exist. The reality is that we do not have a STEM worker shortage in America. For instance, only 1/4 of those graduating with STEM degrees are actually working in STEM. This is largely because wages have been stagnant for the past 25 years. It always comes down to supply and demand. The H-1B visa is issued to skilled aliens working in white-collar jobs, and it's a scam because a person can, and often do, make up phony resumes. They kind of create a resume with these bogus day-to-day job responsibilities that they give to our USCIS officers as to why they deserve an H-1B visa. So, interestingly enough, 3/4 of all H-1B visas issued go to one country, and that's the country of India. Now, there's a belief out there that the H-1B visa brings in highly skilled immigrants. This is not true. They're pretty much ordinary workers, because oddly, the process of obtaining an H-1B visa is not predicated on identifying and recruiting the best and the brightest. It's a random lottery that decides from a pool of applicants each year who receives and doesn't receive the visa. Now, to ensure getting a larger share of applicants of the roughly 85,000 slots, unscrupulous companies like several dozen Indian IT outsourcing consulting firms, or as I like to call them, body shops, submit applications for jobs that don't exist. Once the H-1B recipient arrives in the US, they're rented out to a US company that thinks they're getting a qualified STEM worker, and it's a lucrative trade. One H-1B visa IT consulting firm, Infosys, brought in over $4.5 billion in revenue in the second quarter of this year alone, and that's a 22% increase over the prior year. Big tech companies like Apple and Facebook were recently prosecuted by the Department of Justice for using deceptive tactics to deter American citizens from applying for jobs so they could help foreign visa workers get employment-based green cards. For instance, what they'll do things like this. They'll hire immigration attorneys to ensure that no Americans submit their resumes for jobs, that they're, when they have to go through what they call a perm process, they have to basically publish a job to see if there are any Americans available. And to that end, what they'll do in these instances is the jobs get posted in old newspapers, and to apply for the job, one had to send their resume by snail mail. And these companies purport to tell us that there is a shortage of high-skilled talent. So, in conclusion, there are solutions. First, programs such as H-1B, L-1, optional practical training aren't being used. They're actually working exactly the way the framers intended them to do. and that is displace American workers and also drive down labor costs. Towards the end of President Trump's administration, 3 rule changes were proposed that would have declawed the H-1B program. And they were, he tightened up the definition of what a specialty occupation were, because interestingly enough, these high-skilled workers are coming in to be golf course groundskeepers as well as programming computers. He raised the prevailing wage, and that's helpful because companies enjoy a 20 to 40% benefit of bringing on an H-1B over a native-born American or someone who is lawfully present in the US. And he also replaced the lottery I mentioned with a process that would give a company willing to pay the highest wage first dibs on a foreign worker. That would erase the competition with ordinary STEM workers here in the US. Now, these rule changes were left to die on the vine by the Biden administration, and they need to be implemented by the next administration. Or I'd even offer the whole program needs to be ended. Second, we need to stop using the student visas as a discrete pipeline for getting cheap labor. Optional practical training, or OPT, must be eliminated. It was not legislated into existence. Rather, it's probably the most salient example of bureaucratic overreach today, and actually speaks directly to Chevron and the notion of deference. OPT grants a 3-year employment authorization document to any foreign student graduating with a STEM degree, and right now there are actually more people here on a optional practical training employment authorization document than there are in H-1Bs. And I would also recommend that Congress needs to ask the Supreme Court to revisit and hear a court case called Washtec versus DHS. And it was very clear that the student visa is designed to be just that. Basically giving a 3-year work authorization to someone who graduates, who's a foreigner, hasn't been legislated. It's purely deference, and it was created in a backroom deal between Bill Gates and Michael Chertoff. Third, end the diversity lottery. Enough said there. Fourth, amnesties don't work. Prior to 1986 and Reagan's Immigration Reform and Control Act, roughly 1 million people would come north every year and 1 million people would go south. Because of the amnesty that was embedded in the act, people in the country legally began to stay. Now in 1986, illegal immigration was about a 3 million person problem. Today, conservatively, and Tom would know more about this than I would, it's easily 13 million people. So again, amnesties do not work. Fifth, and Tom spoke to this a little bit, heavily taxed remittances. As Tom mentioned, last year, $70 billion went to just one country, left the country, went to the country of Mexico. In 2022, over $200 billion was left the country in remittances to foreign countries. And finally, the Immigration Act of 1965 created significant changes that still haunt us today, and the following must be legislated to counteract the Act's negative consequences. Number 1, move priority from family to those who possess extraordinary abilities, end chain migration, only nuclear families, that's a spouse and children under the age of 18, and have a high-skilled point system. And lastly, enact a comprehensive U.S. history requirement. And so that's what I see as the problem when it comes to legal immigration and some solutions. And I want to thank you all for your time today.
Thanks so much. This isn't on yet, but I'm sure it will be. We have just a very short amount of time for some questions from you all. If you have a very great question, the greatest of questions, and a succinct one. If you would come to the microphone right here in the middle of the room, we might be able to get 2 or 3 in. I'm going to start with regular people, and then we'll go to the press if none of our if no one else has a question.
Momentum carried me.
Just 1 second, sorry. Does anyone in the room who's not wearing a red lanyard have a question that they, yes, sir, please.
I heard the last person spoke to you talked about birthright citizenship. How do you, I know they might be on the lower priority for deportation, but how do we go after the people that are quote citizens?
Questions about birthright citizenship and,
Or just-
what, if anything, to do about that.
And then just a comment too about the H-1B.
Do you mind, if you don't mind, let's just keep it to the question real quick.
So your question was, I understand, what you would do about the anchor bases. Yeah, the thing is, they're citizens. I mean, I don't think we can contravene anything, but going forward, I think it's up to Congress and possibly the Supreme Court. A decision needs to be reached that by soil, it does not automatically grant citizenship. We need a law to that effect.
Theo?
Yeah, so one thing can be done for those who have been, who are technically citizens, something I worked on in the Trump White House, which was to, I don't know if this is on, but we've been issuing passports, social security cards to the children of foreign diplomats for decades now. And if there's any clarity in the Constitution, that is expressly forbidden. So one thing we can do is say, hey, ambassador from Spain, we know your daughter now has a US passport, we're taking that back. She's not a US citizen because the Constitution is clear she's not entitled to constitutionality, right? Or to citizenship. So nipping on those margins, especially in those cases that the Constitution is clear about, will go a long way to teaching state issuing authorities, especially state hospital staff. You don't get to just issue a documentation for citizenship, passport, social security number to anyone who has a baby in your facility.
We actually researched that, and, oh, it's on now, okay, good. We called the Virginia Department of Health, because a lot of diplomats live in Virginia. You wouldn't want to live in DC. And so we asked them, what do you do when a diplomat, when you receive the, for issuing a birth certificate to a child born to a diplomat? And they were like, we have no idea what you're even talking about. So, so yeah, and the other thing I would add, again, nipping around the edges, make clear that birth tourism is illegal. In other words, say that, honestly, if you're, we need to ask women applying for tourist visas, are you pregnant? I mean, it seems kind of a weird thing to ask, but it's like, have your baby, then you get to come. You just don't get to come, because birth tourism is a very widespread phenomenon. We don't have a lot of time, so we probably
should
take
yes,
more
ma'am.
questions.
Yeah, it's a very short question. Didn't President Biden say recently that there was a surge in Hispanic voters? And then he said, oh, I mean Hispanic citizens. Isn't that part of why we have this change in immigration and all these illegals coming in to vote?
I dissent from a lot of people on our side on this. I don't think this is about voters. I mean, in the long term, sure, but what we're seeing at the border is, in my opinion, not part of a plan. It is the reflection of the moral principle that people running immigration now in this administration and the left generally have, which is that limits on immigration are immoral, period. That it is Jim Crow, or to translate it, Jaimito Cuervo, to say that someone who comes to the border is not let in, and they see themselves as heroic.
No, excuse me, you're not a Democrat. What is the Democrat reason for bringing in all these
That's the reason.
illegals?
No, that's the reason.
No,
That's what
it's
I'm
to bring these people in to register them as Democrats
Yeah.
to vote
But-
in the 2024 presidential election. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
That's why
Thank
they're
you,
bringing them in.
Well, look, let me say this. I don't disagree with you. I think it's a long-term strategy, but we don't have to get there. When Biden signed over 9 executive orders killing everything we did, he also overturned the Trump census rule, which means millions of illegal aliens in sanctuary cities will be counted in the next census. So what happens then? They proportionate seats in the House, which means more seats in the House of Dems, which means control of government. That is, I agree with Mark, but I also think there's a more nefarious thing here about the census controlling government.
All right, lunch is waiting for you all. I imagine that our speakers would be glad to stick around for any additional questions you may have. Thank you for attending today, and thank you, gentlemen. for your comments.